This short video is going to be covering the characteristics, types, and structure of muscle. There are 5 characteristics of muscle that are important to account for. They are namely contractility, extensibility, elasticity, excitability, and conductibility. So to break down each of these into a functional component and describe each of them a little bit more in depth, a muscle needs to be contractile. So it has to be able to apply tension when stimulated. When you think about all of our muscles are all contractile, meaning that when we stimulate them, they have the ability to apply tension. And most of the time we're talking, not in real life, but for this class, most of the time we're talking about contraction, and you're probably thinking of a concentric contraction where that muscle is going to shorten. However, there's going to be instances where a muscle applies tension and the muscle doesn't shorten, like in an isometric or a eccentric contraction. However, nonetheless, a muscle needs to be contractile. Next, extensibility, the ability to stretch. So if you think about a concentric contraction of the biceps brachii, on the opposite side of that muscle is the triceps, and if the triceps muscle is not extensible, then when the bicep muscle contracts, that we won't have very much range of motion at our elbow. So an important characteristic of muscle is that they can stretch. Additionally, muscles need to be elastic. When that stretch is removed, they need to be able to return to a resting length. So when we do a concentric contraction of our biceps brachii muscle, that triceps needs to be able to stretch. However, when we release that contraction of the biceps brachii, the triceps need to be able to return to that pre-stretch state. Last 2 characteristics here, excitable. So it needs to be excited by a stimulus. So at a neuromuscular junction, when a nerve releases a neurotransmitter onto that muscle, the muscle needs to be able to be excited by that neurotransmitter and thus cause a contraction. And finally, that stimulus needs to be able to be conductible. So the ability to move or transmit an impulse. So each of these characteristics you can see might be interrelated. However, they are each distinguishable and important characteristics of every muscle that we have. Next, we will move into the muscle types. I anticipate that for many of you this will be a review. However, there are 3 types of muscle. Namely, they are skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. We are going to first cover skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle's innervation is from the somatic nervous system. What does that mean? It means that skeletal muscle is voluntarily contracted. The somatic nervous system, it is voluntarily contracted. If you take a moment and you just think about your body in general, you will appreciate very quickly how much of your body is actually made up of skeletal muscle. We can see here the skeletal muscle comprises 40 to 50% of total body weight and is made up of over 600 individual muscles, responsible for movement, posture, and heat production. When we get cold, we shiver, etc. Skeletal muscle is striated and multinucleated. We're going to see a picture of that coming up. Last 2 thoughts here on skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle varies in content of myoglobin. High myoglobin content carries O2 within a muscle, so we call this a red or a slow twitch muscle. Low myoglobin is white or a fast twitch muscle fiber. I have a picture here. A long time ago, when someone was introducing me to myoglobin, they started to talk a little bit about meat colors that someone might eat, and it's something that has stuck with me. So chicken, for example, is a very light meat in coloration. It's white, it's not dark. The myoglobin of chicken is very, very low. And when myoglobin, this is for a physiology class, but myoglobin, similar to hemoglobin, carries oxygen within a muscle. Chickens don't fly. They don't do a lot of work. They kind of stand around. They nest, they roost. So they don't need to have much myoglobin. So it stands to reason that their myoglobin content tends to be fairly low. However, if you have ever eaten duck or lamb, you will appreciate that the coloration of that meat is much, much darker. Now you think about the activities of a duck compared to a chicken. Ducks need to fly. They migrate. They have to be able to fly long distances. They have to fly to water. They have to go long other places. It's very important within a duck that their muscles are able to carry oxygen for longer periods of time. So again, it stands to reason that their myoglobin content is going to be higher. So if that's something that helps you, feel free to use it. It's something that has stuck with me over all these years. Skeletal muscle can vary in content of myoglobin. If a muscle has high myoglobin content, we call it a red or slow twitch fiber type 1. If a skeletal muscle has low myoglobin content, it is a white or fast twitch fiber type 2. Moving into smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. What does this mean? It means that we don't generally have control over this. Smooth muscle is found in the wall of hollow visceral organs, tubes, and vessels. I'm just going to, organs, tubes, and vessels, blood and lymphatic vessels. So all of these are actually structurally similar. There's a hollow space with the skeletal muscle surrounding it. So the smooth muscle is going to help with constriction and dilation of these hollow organs. Smooth muscle is non-striated, not organized in orderly sarcomeres, unlike skeletal muscle, striated. Smooth muscle has smaller muscle fibers than skeletal muscle fibers. Relaxed smooth muscle are 30 to 200 micrometers, and it's thickest in the middle, and it kind of tapers. I think we have a picture coming up. Maybe we don't. I will show us one in class. Skeletal or smooth muscle fibers kind of taper. There is a centrally single nucleus, a single centrally located nucleus, unlike skeletal muscle, which had multi-nuclei also located at the periphery. So if you compare and contrast these muscle types. Finally, moving into cardiac muscle, again, involuntarily controlled or by the autonomic nervous system. Comprises walls and partitions of the heart. The only place we find cardiac muscle is at the heart. Cardiac muscle is striated, similar to skeletal muscle, unlike smooth muscle. Each fiber has a single centrally placed nucleus. Occasionally, a cardiac muscle fiber will have two, so on occasion, this is going to be multinucleated. Has a similar arrangement of actin and myosin and bands and zones as skeletal muscle. Here's a little bit about the length and the diameter. And then finally, a single action potential remains contracted for much longer than a skeletal muscle. And as you move on in your classes, we won't talk much more about that here, but that's going to become important when the cardiac muscle has a very specific job to move blood from the heart through all of the vessels in this closed circulatory system. So these contractions need to be powerful and strong and take some time. So here's a table that compares and contrasts a few different characteristics of the three different types of muscles. So smooth muscle, involuntary, internal organs, a single nucleus, not striated. Cardiac muscle, striated, similar to skeletal muscle. So smooth muscle is unique in its striation or non-striation. But however, smooth and cardiac are both involuntarily controlled. You can find this in the heart wall, find this in the walls of internal organs, and then finally our skeletal muscle. A few more points here. So gross anatomy of a skeletal muscle, I anticipate that at least by now you've heard these terms. I know that we have heard them to this point in class. Muscles are going to have an origin, the more stable end of the muscle attachment. They will have an insertion, the less stable end of the muscle attachment, usually distal. Muscles are generally attached to bones via tendons. You'll see many of those tendons as you study on the cadavers. Additionally, there's a term fascia, which is a gross term indicating all fibrous bands of connective tissue. So fascia is not actually a very descriptive term, but it is a general overall term indicating fibrous bands of connective tissue. And then finally, an aponeurosis, a fibrous or membranous, closely packed parallel collagen bundle that provides strength and support to structures. Muscles, muscle composition. So individual muscle cells called muscle fibers that we'll see here, muscle fibers, come back up here, are about 10 to 100 micrometers in diameter. However, they run along the entire length of a muscle. So they may be 12 inches or more in length depending on that muscle. So if you pause and think for a second, we're in lower extremity. If you think about the relative length of the sartorius to the iliacus muscle, those sartorius muscle fibers are going to be very, very long, whereas the iliacus muscle fibers in comparison will be relatively shorter. The muscle fibers are held together by a fascia, again, a very nondescript term. A more descript term is going to be this one down here. The thin fascial sheath that surrounds the cell membrane of each muscle fiber is called an endomysium. Endomysium is on our words list for this unit. So this muscle fiber will be surrounded by an endomysium. You can see they've outlined it here. Bundles of muscle fibers are called fasciculi or muscle fascicles, which are surrounded by a paramysium. Paramysium, and you can break that word down, perimysium. And then finally, the entirety of the muscle is covered by an epimysium, or upon a muscle, an epimysium. So this would be a muscle. This is a muscle fascicle and a muscle fiber. You'll notice here on the skeletal muscle the multi-nucleated disposition of these muscles. Multiple nuclei on a single muscle fiber, and then inside of this muscle cell we're going to have all sorts of actin and myosin, which contributes to its striations. And that finishes this video on the characteristics, types, and structure of muscle.